Hello my beautiful watchers, and welcome back to Lost in Adaptation, a show about how loyally films based on books follow the original text. Today we're looking at It Chapter 2, the final installment in the films based on It by Stephen King. If by some cruel twist of fate you found yourself at this video without having first watched its predecessor, now might be the ideal time to correct that grievous error so you're not confused by the lack of context. Or don't, do whatever you want, YOLO, as the children say. As two films was the plan from the very concept onwards, nothing short of an utter flop at the box office would have stopped the second half from being made, so after the first film had the 29th largest opening weekend of all time, things were pretty set in stone. Fun story, during marketing interviews, the cast of the first movie were asked who they'd like to see playing the adult versions of their characters, and both Sophia Lillis and Finn Wolfhard named actors who ended up getting the roles in an amusing, self-fulfilling prophecy situation. Said prophesized actors were Jessica Chastain and Bill Hader, and they were joined by James McAvoy, James Ransom, Jay Ryan, Isaiah Mustafa, and Andy Bean as the adult losers, and of course Bill Skarsgård returned as the space clown from hell. While I don't have definitive proof of this, I suspect a larger role for the young cast was written into the script after their runaway popularity in Chapter 1. Because kids grow up so fast, they use digital de-aging technology to keep them looking exactly the same, and one has to assume they would have just filmed these scenes while making the first movie if it had always been the plan for them to be as involved in the sequel. Because they apparently got all the production drama and multiple crew changes out of their system the first time around, Andy Muschietti stayed on as director, and principal photography on the film began in June 2018, and it was released on September 6, 2019. The box office results were an undeniable success, if a bit less so than its predecessor, and reviews in general were good but not overwhelmingly so, with the film's 3-hour length and unfocused plot usually cited as the drag factor holding it back, which, while a valid criticism, cannot possibly have come to a surprise to anyone considering long and unfocused describes like 80% of the source material. Speaking of which, the story, unfortunately, gets started with a hate crime. Taking umbrage with a young gay gentleman wearing a hat that proclaims his love for Derry, some local youths beat him half to death and throw him in the river, where the poor sod is snacked on by Pennywise. Not very fun fact, this scene was the reason I failed to read this book twice over the span of about 10 years. I got too depressed to make it past Chapter 2 both times. I think the reason that Adrian's death hit me much harder than, say, poor Georgie's was the lack of an obvious supernatural element until right at the end. It was just too real. And you know, I almost wrote down that such an attack would be less likely because the film was set in 2016, then kicked myself for being naive. But, getting back to the plot, Mike, the only one of the Losers Club to have remained in Derry, sees Adrian's murder as a sign that it has returned, and also the literal sign that it left for his friends. So he calls them one by one to ask them to fulfill the blood oath they took as children and return to their hometown to kill the clown once and for all. The other 6 members of the club appear to have developed some form of selective amnesia over the years that drove the supernatural events of their childhoods out of their minds and even affected their physical bodies. As scars that they got during the battle and the subsequent hand slicing for the blood oath had vanished, but Mike's call immediately starts to revive their past memories and injuries. The lives that they'd been living up until this point are fairly accurate to the book. Bill, who grew up to be a rather unsubtle author insert, became an extremely successful schlock horror novelist and screenplay writer, making the decision to involve him in the King cameo scene even more amusing. Eddie married a woman extremely similar to his mother, and can I just say props to the film for using the same actress for both roles. That was both clever and hilarious. Richie was a radio personality originally, but stand-up comedian is close enough. Ben is an extremely successful architect now, and at some point before reaching adulthood, he'd gotten into much better shape. It's not specifically mentioned in the book that he'd also become hot as fuck, but you have to let films be films when it comes to casting eye candy. Bev had, unfortunately, also performed some sort of emotional incest by marrying a guy who was as abusive as her father. To say that being one of its long-term victims has an upside would be a stretch, but it does help put things in perspective. Standing up to a team of child delinquents seems like less of a challenge when you have to battle a demon clown from literal outer space. In this vein, the news that It has returned finally snaps Beverly out of the spell her emotionally manipulative husband had over her, and she fights back for the first time in their marriage. Unfortunately, it has the opposite effect on Stanley, who immediately chooses to end his own life in the bathtub after he gets the call. The gang reunite and share a meal, a succulent Chinese meal, during which It officially starts messing with them again, filling their fortune cookies with weird and disgusting creepy crawlies. As soon as they're back in Derry, the group start to regress into certain symbolic elements of their childhood, e.g. Bill's speech impediment that hadn't affected him in years but suddenly starts up again. The clubhouse, the hidden den that the losers constructed then used as a base of operations missing from the first movie, is retroactively introduced into the story now. Side note, I'm not entirely sure why they decided to make Eddie such a fucking asshole in these flashbacks. Once all of the surviving members of the team are on board with the upcoming clown battle, Mike sends them to wander around town alone to get things started, and everyone has a bad time. Bev ends up at her father's old apartment where she's invited in by what appears to be a kindly old lady who informs her over tea that her dad passed away, then turns into a horrible frickin' monster because she was Pennywise all along. If there was any single part of the book that I would have bet money against making it into the film, it would obviously be the underage group sex, but the runner-up would have been the scene where a Paul Bunyan statue comes to life and chases Richie down the street, so I was pleasantly surprised and amused to see it actually made it into Chapter 2. Bill is shocked to find his old bike Silver in a pawn shop, and even though he's screwed on the price, he's happy to be reunited with his trusty steed. Meanwhile, their childhood bully Henry Bowers, who, after being charged with the murder of his father, had spent the last 30 years as an inpatient in a criminal psychiatric ward, escapes with It's help and, armed with his old childhood knife, is sent to hunt the Losers Club once again. He starts by attacking Mike at his job at the public library, and it's around here that the adherence to the book gets a lot more sketchy, but there's still a few things that coincide. They head back down into the Underdark of Derry and kill it by pulling its heart out and crushing it, despite it getting all spidery on them. Unfortunately at the cost of Eddie's life, as he dies heroically. Afterwards, Bev and Ben become a couple, and everyone bounces out of Derry, including Mike this time. So yeah, both versions of the story have a happy ending that came at a high price. How they got to it, however... Because they brought the kids back for so many flashbacks, Chapter 2 resembles the novel's formatting significantly more than its predecessor, but it's still nowhere near the same level of back and forth timeline switching as the book. This is doubly true at the climax, during which the narrative started switching multiple times a chapter and even did so mid-sentence on several occasions. The gang's amnesia wears off much quicker in the film, as they appear to have pretty much all the relevant facts back by the time they finish their reunion dinner. The process takes pretty much their entire stay in Derry in the book, but I mean, I guess there wasn't really much point in dragging it out in the film, as the child side of the story had already completely played out, so the audience would only have been frustrated by the characters remembering it piecemeal. Honestly, sheer morbid curiosity about what was locked away in their memories was a factor in the group staying pretty committed to seeing the quest through to the end, even if they were all pants-soilingly frightened the entire time. In the film, almost every member of the club tries to dip at least once, twice in Richie's case, though he obviously comes back both times. So again, the decision to split the films into timelines doesn't change a ton about the story, but changes almost everything about how the story was supposed to be presented. All through the start of their renewed struggles with it in Derry, the adult losers and the reader have no idea how they defeated Pennywise the first time around, or the full extent of what he's capable of. It contributed heavily to the sense of suspense and dread, and like many other aspects of the book like it, the film had to compensate for its absence with yet more jump scares and gross imagery. There's multiple film original comedic moments throughout. Some were pretty funny.
You should cut that fucking mullet. It's been like 30 years, man.
Others I felt missed the mark somewhat. I didn't edit that clip. That's the song from the fucking Deadpool trailer, like, what? Apparently some of the jokes were improvised by Bill Hader, who brought his Saturday Night Live energy to the production. Others were the work of writer Gary Doberman, who wanted the occasional lighter-hearted moment to break up the tension and make the film more fun to watch. Thankfully, I don't think it was common enough to get into full bathos territory and ruin the overall vibe. The film clearly wasn't afraid to have most serious horror moments be serious horror moments. Although they did lean into the Bill is Steven joke pretty hard, taking it even further than the book by adding a recurring gag that nobody liked the endings to his novels, a common complaint about the real-life author's work. Oh, and FYI, Bill was supposed to be almost completely bald by this point in his life, but I guess they didn't want to make poor McAvoy shave his head for a role again. Eddie is reduced to having a very boring job as an insurance analyst in the film, even though he originally ran a high-end limo service. I only mention it because he was due to be chauffeuring Al Pacino to his theatre performances the week he got the call to return to Derry, and had to leave his exceptionally anxious wife to have miniature heart attacks about having to fill in because she was a terrible driver and had no sense of direction. It could have been a prime opportunity for a celebrity cameo is all I'm saying. It could have been anyone in the back of his car, like fucking Samuel L. Jackson.
No, motherfucker!
Both films cut out just how much Richie hated wearing thick glasses as a kid, so had switched to contacts as soon as he could afford them. After he'd been in Derry for a while, Pennywise forced him to regress back to glasses by making his contacts red hot. They replaced this drama with a sub-arc about him struggling with his closeted sexuality, eventually revealing that he had secretly been in love with Eddie in their youth, which, I mean, that just adds an even greater level of tragedy onto his friend's demise. In a change that's pretty indicative of the adaptation as a whole, instead of slowly turning into a hag right before Beverly's eyes while the house around her turns into gingerbread, the old lady jump scares her by leaping out of the darkness fully nude. Damn, guys. Henry's post-escape stabbing rampage went down a little differently in the book. The film depicts him trying to kill Eddie first and getting wounded for his troubles, then attacking Mike in the library, where Richie finally kills him with, I think, a tomahawk? Book Bowers attacked Mike first and injured him so badly Mike was hospitalized for the rest of the story. Henry was hurt too, but still went to Eddie's hotel room to try to kill him and surprisingly lost the fight as Eddie kills him with a broken bottle. Mike wasn't out of the story completely, as the gang had to take a moment during the boss fight to magically send him their combined strength so he can fend off a would-be assassin that Pennywise sent to finish him off in the hospital, but he's not able to be there for the final showdown in person, which super sucked for the losers, as it had been established that the power they had gained from the turtle and their past experiences and whatnot grew exponentially weaker the fewer of them there were. The number 7 in particular had a lot of magic juice apparently, so with Stan and Mike out of the game, they were considerably more fucked. However, the film had already downplayed a lot of the tangible power of friendship stuff, so there wasn't a significant loss of tension by letting Mike be less fucked so he could be a part of the second trip into the bowels of the earth, which, I don't know, I think is more satisfying from a screenplay perspective. This version of events still lets Eddie have a cool moment and ties into a quick subplot they went through where Richie almost left town but was inspired by a memory of Stanley showing courage at his bar mitzvah to come back just in time to save Mike. Oh man, do I wish that had been the only thing they did to try to keep Stan in the story. The film tones down Beverly and Bill's romantic climax from the night of passion they shared in bed together in the book to, you know, just a kiss, just a little smooch. One assumes because of a combination of limited time and not wanting one of their leads to be a douchebag who cheats on his wife, or at least not as badly. I'm not personally super sad to see this change. I thought it was a little wild that King made his Mary Sue a cheater in the first place, and I mean, cards on the table, I've always been made a bit uncomfortable with the way that King writes about sex, and in this case it was made especially awkward because the memory of, you know, the dreaded sewer escape event came back to Beverly mid-shag. The film adds a frickin' rough original scene where Bill fails to save a local kid who'd been dipping in and out of the story for a while from Pennywise during a carnival. It may not have been in the book, but dang, it was effective. The kid has a much smaller role originally, and he lives to see the end, thankfully. Unless I missed it, there was no official declaration of love between Ben and Bev during the final showdown in the book. They just kind of get together off-page in the aftermath. But of course, the film introduces the power of love that saves them from one of its space-warping underground traps. The ritual of Chud, like the showdown at the end of the first movie, is stripped of the massive metaphysical element it had originally, and exclusively in the film, it's now a Native American ritual that involves potentially trapping it in a container and requires sacrificial tokens of emotional value from all participants. Whether or not Native Americans are actually magic, or if everything that seemed magical about them was just the result of the observer tripping balls on root drugs, is somewhat ambiguous in the film, as the ritual ultimately proves to be completely ineffective. Mike neglects to mention that the tribe that tried to use it all those centuries ago had been brutally slaughtered, claiming that was because they didn't believe in it hard enough, and he was hoping that if the others didn't know that, it would work for them, but of course it doesn't, because the power of belief is kind of inconsistent in the film. And honestly, I just don't follow Mike's logic even within the context of the film. Like, it didn't work for the Native Americans because they didn't believe it would, but they created it. Why would they do that if they didn't think it would work? In the book, the closest thing we get to this is a brief mention of a Himalayan myth about how to defeat an evil shape-shifting spirit, which involves a mutual biting of tongues and then having a joke-telling competition. It made a little bit more sense when King was explaining it, I swear. Later, as young Bill is fighting it on their way to the microverse, Maturin the Turtle hints to him that he should try deploying things he has faith in, and because he'd heard this story, he sort of metaphorically, metaphysically, psychically bites its metaphorical, metaphysical, psychic tongue, and his juvenile imagination gives this act power and the upper hand over it. There was a magic vision in the book, but it took place in the kids' timeline and also didn't have anything directly to do with Native American magic, although the kids did borrow the idea of a sweat lodge from them. Probably guided by our boy the Turtle, they light a fire in their underground clubhouse and try to gain some spiritual knowledge regarding Pennywise, but all but Bill and Mike couldn't handle the smoke inhalation and had to leave. The remaining two receive a vision of it arriving on Earth, smashing down from space like a meteor an uncertain amount of time ago, but certainly before the area had been settled by any humans, vaguely referred to as ago. As in, like, long ago. You kind of see a brief hint at this at the start of the vision that adult Mike forced on adult Bill by drugging him, but it switches away from this and to the backstory of the Native American tribe that tried to chud him pretty quickly. So, let's talk about the Deadlights. Technically, the film was not initially wrong by depicting them as orange lights that send mortals into a comatose state if observed, though why the heck they made them blue later, I'll never know. They're more than just that, though. Like many things in Stephen King's novels, they're a bit hard to explain because they're super metaphysical and often part of the extended universe of his books. The Deadlights are described as a writhing mass of radiant orange lights that humans cannot look upon without instantly dying. Pennywise can show people a glimpse of what I assume must be a filtered version of it, which only causes madness or sends them into a permanent comatose state. The lights apparently originated from the macroverse outside of our universe where it and Maturin the Turtle were created. This micro-universe is also entirely composed of the Deadlights, as is its true form. So it is kind of from there, but also made of there, so I guess it is there. The microverse and the Deadlights and Pennywise are kind of the same thing, but also not, because while Pennywise's true form is made entirely of Deadlights and only exists outside of our universe, it also has a physical form that can exist on Earth, because even though its body is also impossible for humans to truly comprehend because of the confusing metaphysical nature of it and his connection to the power of belief, by being observed by humans, it's transformed into the closest thing that their minds can understand, namely a giant fucking spider, and because spiders are mortal, this means that even though the Deadlights can't ever be destroyed, Pennywise can. And they're just kind of little floating fairy lights in the film that are never directly addressed. They're like an eldritch version of Navi.
Hey! Listen!
And they just kind of fizzle out at the end. So yes, the Deadlights is a malevolent energy, the microverse, what it is really made of, and also a weapon wielded by a really bad dude known as the Crimson King. I'm Glad we cleared that up. You know, I started this description mad, but now I'm kind of on the film side. Yes, they didn't even really try to get across the Deadlights deal, but how the fuck could they have? It took King a book longer than the Bible and several other books to give us a confusing idea of what the fuck it is. Honestly, making them present for the book readers to recognize, but also making them simple enough that a layman can easily intuit that they're just part of Pennywise's whole thing, was probably the only viable option. Much like Chapter 1, the ending of the film is probably what differs the most from what King wrote. I know, huge surprise, right? The script that constantly ribbed on King and his self-insert character for unpopular endings decided to change how the story concluded. It would be a lot more surprising if they'd stuck to the novel after all that. While Chapter 2 leans into the extra-dimensional vibe regarding killing it a little more than its precursor, as traditional physics clearly aren't welcome in any of the weird shenanigans that the losers have to go through underground, they still skip over the whole space, soul-throwing, magic tongue-biting thing again in favor of finishing him off in a much more material planey way. After the ritual of Chud fails, the majority of the climax is it toying with the Losers Club with what is basically an interactive haunted house, throwing random scary stuff at them over and over until they all manage to struggle their way back to the main chamber, where it sort of becomes spidery while still sticking to the clown motif. BTW, I just have to say major props to them for paying off a joke that they'd set up 2 years earlier. That was hilarious. Eddie then overcomes his innate cowardice and saves Richie, but gets impaled immediately afterwards. Then things get a bit... I don't even know. Questionable. Their first plan is to trick it into shrinking down to shankable size by tricking him into climbing into a tunnel that's too small for him, but when he cuts them off from this, they decide to make him believe that he's small by shouting at him that he's a clown over and over again.
I'm leader of
I mean, guys, I think he already knew that. He chose that form. He's probably not, you know, sensitive about it, but apparently he is, and he deflates like an elderly balloon, and they all crush his heart together. Well done, go team. So, what did this replace? Well, once again, Pennywise decided to psychically dropkick Bill's soul out into space, where Bill was hoping to run into his old friend the turtle again, but unfortunately... I'm not afraid of you! I've got the power of Maturin on my side!
Huh? Oh no, that motherfucker's dead. He choked on his own vomit a few years ago.
I don't believe you! Shit. Huh. That's kind of an anticlimactic way for the creator of the universe to die.
I mean, you're not wrong.
Even with his demigod sponsor out of the picture, Bill still tries the old mind-tongue-biting trick that he pulled off when he was a kid, but unfortunately he's actually less powerful now as an adult combatant because children are able to blindly believe in things way better than adults, so middle-aged Bill was too filled with doubts and cynicism to get the job done. He sends out a mental SOS, so Richie kind of dives into the spiritual realm or whatever to try to help him, but even together they can't handle it, so Eddie distracts it in the physical world by spraying his inhaler into its eyes while concentrating on it being full of acid, wounding him enough to give the Mindscape boys the upper hand, but getting his arm bitten off in the process and bleeding to death. Now on the ropes, it tries fleeing down the same tunnel it had used to escape 30 years before. Bev stays with Eddie while the others chase after it, and they discover that it is leaving behind a trail of eggs, leading them to conclude that it is female and she is pregnant. I personally think that at this point, gender is a wildly inadequate construct to describe what the fuck its deal is, but the book was written in the 80s. Ben has to stay behind to step on all the eggs, so it was really down to just Richie and Bill, who, against all the odds, do in fact beat up it, and Bill tears its heart out and squishes it. Once again, when it was backed into a corner, it started begging for its life and even offered the group riches, power, and extended lifespans. Weirdly, it admits that it can't promise them immortality, which is surprisingly honest of it. I guess making offers it can't follow through on is where Pennywise draws the line on ethical behavior. The film openly flaunts doing the exact opposite of the book in what is effectively the epilogue. Originally, after it is finally killed for real, the Losers Club starts to forget it and each other all over again, including Mike this time. He has mixed feelings about this for a while, but in the end decides to embrace it and just get on with his life. It's bittersweet. In the film's dialogue, they make a point of wondering aloud about why they're not losing their memories this time around, and take it as proof that Pennywise is truly gone. I guess they just wanted more closure for the characters and the audience. I mean, yeah, it sucks that everyone was going to forget what they achieved, forget each other, forget their friendship with Stanley, and worst of all, forget Eddie and his sacrifice. King always had a bit of a fuck your feelings attitude towards his endings, hence all the ribbing. And just before the end of the film, they were so close to finishing it, they drive right smack into the most controversial change of both movies. Stanley's suicide note. I'm just gonna quickly double up on the content warning. We're gonna talk about this. It's the last thing on the list, so if you want to use this time code to skip to the left out altogether segment, you're not gonna miss anything else. It's all good. Okay. Apparently posted so it would arrive too late to be of any actual relevance to the battle with it, this last-minute addition to the plot completely recontextualizes one of the most shocking plot twists of the book, and the result is, I assume, unintentionally concerning in what it implies. Stanley's suicide was an act of pure fear in the book. He was so terrified by the mere knowledge that it was back in action, he immediately ended his own life. It was shocking and depressing, and there's no closure for it for the rest of the cast. It's a straight up terrible, terrible thing. Because it happens at the start of the book when you don't have much idea what's happening, it sets the stakes and suspense super high for both timelines. In the film, Bro explains that basically he knew that he would be a hindrance to the group in the battle with it, but knew that if he stayed home it would upset the power of the oath or something, so he was nobly sacrificing himself to take himself out of the equation and give the others a better fighting chance. I mean, yikes. I'm definitely not the only person who felt deeply uncomfortable with the act of taking one's own life being portrayed as a noble sacrifice for the betterment of one's friends. I would never judge someone for feeling like they can't go on, but it's just straight up irresponsible to glorify that kind of decision. I think we can all understand the director and writer's logic. They wanted to cushion the visceral, emotional gut punch of this twist, and to be fair, said gut punch was probably worse in the film because the audience had had a whole movie's worth of time to get invested in this kid before the rug was pulled out from under them. But doesn't that also rob it of its value? What King wrote was viscerally real, and that's why it hits so hard. When people kill themselves in real life, there is no easy closure for their survivors. There's no upside to it. I'm also pissed that the film tried to have its cake and eat it by waiting to drop this little cop-out until right at the end, so the group could still be horrified about Stanley's death in the moment, but then tried to sugarcoat it right before the fucking credits. I feel confident in saying that this was a nobly liked that decision and an unfortunate blight on an otherwise well-intentioned adaptation. Much like the first movie, there's a shit ton of tangential world building that got lost in the ether. A lot of side characters got a whole ass backstory right before their very small contribution to the main plot. Stanley's wife, for example, her only important role in the book was finding the poor bastard's body, but she gets her own short story about how she's carrying a lot of mental trauma around with her because she's had to deal with anti-Semitism her whole life, and this isn't even in Derry, so it's not even Pennywise-inspired hate, it's just regular mortal anti-Semitism. Some of the cast partners did have a bigger role in the plot though. Beverly's husband Tom and Bill's wife Audra both ended up following their errant spouses to Derry, and their stories overlap slightly. Tom, being the sadistic, abusive manipulator that he was, could not stand the idea of Bev escaping his orbit, so set out to track her down, starting by assaulting her best friend, who she'd gone to for help after she walked out. This friend, Kay, was a rich, published feminist writer. She was unable to withhold any information from Tom after he threatened to do permanent damage to her, and even though she eventually leaves an answer phone message warning Bev that he's coming, she can't bring herself to report the crime to the police because Tom had threatened to come back and kill her if she did. I'm not sure if this is supposed to be a critique of performative feminism, or a reflection of how ideals can crumble in the face of extreme violence, or if I'm just reading way too much into King's insistence that every cameo character got their own 10-page backstory. Anyways, Tom makes his way to Derry, and because weak or evil people are susceptible to Pennywise's influence, he immediately becomes its puppet. Audra, meanwhile, was just worried about her husband's state of mind and was trying to find him. Unfortunately, Unfortunately, it made Tom kidnap her and bring her to him. Tom's death is somewhat underwhelming considering what a hate sink he'd been all the way through the book. During one of Pennywise's brief POV moments, he casually remembers killing him instantly by giving him a quick look at the deadlights, and that's it. Audra presumably got a dose of the watered down lights because she's only put in a coma and webbed up like a fly for later consumption. Bill sees her hanging from the ceiling on the way to finish off it and is understandably completely freaked out, but the other losers manage to keep him on track and he successfully grabs her on the way out. She remains comatose for quite a long time afterwards, but in the final chapter, Bill manages to snap her out of it by taking her on a ride on Silver and soaking up the very last of the power zapping around Derry, so I guess happy ending there? I wonder if she ended up forgetting about him cheating on her the way they forgot about the evil space clown. And finally, the film restricts itself to just demolishing the old house that covered the entrance to its lair and omitting that the entire fucking town of Derry fucking explodes right after Pennywise dies. Okay, maybe it wasn't that dramatic, but yeah, the entire town is destroyed by earthquakes and floods and a bunch of other biblical shit. Derry and it were so intertwined cosmically, the town could not outlive its demonic patron. The earth literally swallowed it the moment that Pennywise died. A lot of people were killed and they never quite rebuilt it, at least not to the size it was before, as new shit kept falling apart year after year. This omission kind of reminds me of the way that they didn't blow up the hotel at the end of The Shining and King's famously negative feelings about that flick. I hope he was more chill about this example. Final thoughts. There's an interview from 1993 that I've been thinking about a lot regarding this adaptation.
What kind of books do you write?
If you ask the ordinary run-of-the-mill reader, I guess that I write horror novels. I think that what I actually write are suspense novels.
What's the difference?
I think that the purpose of the horror novel is to sort of gross you out. My idea of it is, and I'm not averse to this, I will do this, it's part of the fun of it, is it's kind of when you're a kid and you're sitting at the dining room table and you want to get to your sister or your brother, you kind of chew up your food and then you hang your mouth open like that. That's horror. Suspense is a little more high class than that, so maybe that's why
my mother used to say that was tasteless.
That's tasteless, yeah, that's right.
King is not opposed to grossing his audience out to elicit a horrified response, but it's not what he likes to think is his MO when it comes to his writing, and I agree. It's harder to make the same claim for the films. I mean, they didn't add pendulous granny tits to the witch for suspense purposes. But, as I said in the last episode, and do remember that this is just one shockingly handsome Anglo expat's opinion on the subject, but it's hard for me to blame them for choosing to go a less subtle route, as past attempts to recreate King's scenes word for word, as it were, have famously not translated well to film. So they didn't exactly recreate King's self-identified genre, and they toned down the metaphysical elements of his story. Also, I'm sorry if you're tired of hearing that word, it's just the most appropriate. But I just can't shake the feeling that I don't know, that they were trying to make Stephen King done right for an author whose writing is undeniably effective but doesn't always translate well to a visual medium while still making it consumable for a movie-going audience. It's far from perfect. In fact, I would say it's fair to say it's relatively shallow compared to the original, and it's a damn shame that so many things from the extended Kingverse couldn't be included in it, but it doesn't come off as someone trying to usurp the author's intent with their own vision or incompetence, and that goes a long way for me personally. They made a Stephen King horror adaptation that is reasonably close to the source material and still good, and that is quite the achievement. Because the plot was, for the most part, pretty loyal to the book, I maintain that the biggest difference between the experience of reading the novels and watching the films is the lack of parallel storytelling. It's kind of the book's thing, and the movies, the first one in particular, are just different without it. Not necessarily worse, but different. Thank you for joining me, my beautiful watchers, and an extra special thank you to Nebula. If your curiosity regarding It adaptations extends to the 1990s TV miniseries, I have some good news for you. I've just posted my review of it on Nebula. This is one of many videos I'm planning to post exclusively on the up-and-coming prestigious streaming service, like my unhinged rant about the god-awful mess that was Zack Snyder's Rebel Moon, and older episodes of Lost in Adaptation that can't be posted on YouTube, like Howl's Moving Castle. I'm honestly pretty darn proud to be a part of Nebula now, as it's a creator-founded streaming service that allows its members to take their work to the next level. I personally enjoyed Lindsay Ellis's breakdown of how they adapted The Lord of the Rings, as I've kind of been too scared to go too deep into that particular subject for depth of lore reasons. They even funded my friend Jessie's feature-length film and the hiring of Star Trek's John Delancey. They enabled her to hire frickin' Q, and you can watch Identities or my exclusive It Ramble right this second now by getting a monthly plan at a mere $6 a month, or you can use my link nebula.tv/Dominic Noble, available in the video description, to get 40% off an annual subscription, making it just $36 for the entire year, so about $3 a month. This subscription gives you access to all of Nebula's exclusive content from all of its creators, and it's a great way to support your favorite online personalities, including your boy here. If you've not seen my other Stephen King adaptation reviews and would like to, I've made a convenient playlist for you, or if you'd like to mix it up a bit, this link should be a random selection of my work that you might enjoy. Either way, I hope you'll join me next time.